would make a splendid computer.
Why Israel's opposition won't talk about the real goal of judicial overhaul. Government officials have explicitly said their legal reforms are about annexation. Opponents won't admit because they share the same vision. They won't admit it. Almost exactly 10 years ago, Israeli Justice Minister Yair Levin, then a young rising star in Netanyahu's Likud party, spoke at a conference put on by the Israeli Sovereignty Movement, which advocates for Israel to fully annex the occupied Palestinian territories. Before laying out a four-stage plan for what may have called creeping annexation through smaller incremental steps of applying Israel law to the West Bank, Levin had a warning for his audience of ideologues. I've no doubt that we'll be able not too long from now to extend sovereignty over the entire land of Israel, he assured the attendees. It's important to see the vision because sometimes it clashes with the tactics and compromises that must be made along the way. We need to stick to the vision but behave wisely in the day-to-day, I might even say with sophistication at times, in order to ultimately achieve our goal. A year later, Levin again spoke at the conference beyond the under-the-radar and harder-to-stop steps that he presented in his previous appearance. The Likud politician introduced two major prerequisites for full annexation. The first, he cautioned, is a slow and patient campaign to change the way Israeli public, including the annexationist Israeli right, thinks and talks about the Palestinian issue, after decades in which the Oslo Accords and the two-state solution framed the conversation. The second sine qua non for annexation he discussed was far bolder, a complete overhaul of Israel's legal and judicial systems. We cannot accept the current situation in which the judicial system is controlled by a radical leftist, post-Zionist minority that elects itself behind closed doors, dictating to us its own values, not just in annexation, but also on other issues, Levin explained. A change in the legal system is essential because it will allow us and will make much easier for us to take tangible steps on the ground that strengthen the process of advancing sovereignty. Many on the Israeli right view the country's judiciary, which in reality has supported and enabled the very existence and expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, as hostile to the settler movement. They see occasional constraints the court has implemented, in particular that it struck down a law that would have legalized settlements built on stolen private Palestinian property as the central impediment to their ability to fulfill their annexationist dreams, which for them are a combination of messianic and ideological commandments. Fast forward 10 years and Levin is Israel's new justice minister, fast-tracking a complete overhaul of the country's legal and judicial systems, in a process many within Israel are calling an attempted coup d'etat. The plans have sparked a mass protest movement in Israel that's seen weekly demonstrations, national strikes, threats of capital flight, and high-profile figures calling for civil disobedience. Despite the growing uproar, the Knesset on Monday night passed the first reading of a bill that would give the government greater control over Israel's Judicial Selection Committee and block the Supreme Court from exercising judicial review of the country's basic laws. The bill requires 2 more readings to be enacted into law. In a country with a constitutional order characterized by its leaders' innumerable decisions to not make decisions, the prospect of a determined far-right government consolidating power and subverting the only institutional check on its ambitions is indeed terrifying. And so, in the minds of many Israelis, they are in a fight to save the democracy, freedoms, and liberties that have been their experience of the country for 3/4 of a century. But that prompts a critical question. Why is the underlying ideological and policy goal propelling this far-right overhaul of Israel's entire system of governance, that is, unilaterally annexing the occupied territories, so absent from the public discourse and the outcry in the streets? Not a radical agenda. One doesn't need to look to 10-year-old YouTube videos to understand the fanatic obsession the Israeli right has with the annexation. Just a few years ago, in a government not dissimilar to today's, Netanyahu said he was days away from officially annexing large swaths of the occupied West Bank, a plan reportedly frozen in exchange for normalized diplomatic relations with the United Arab Emirates, followed by Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Following that disaster for the annexationist right, the Knesset Speaker, Yarav Levin, together with the now Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, established the Caucus for the Land of Israel in 2020, while warning his ideological bedfellows that as Knesset Speaker he will have to speak in a stately manner. Levin reassured his allies at the caucus's first meeting that he'd nevertheless work to advance annexation. Sovereignty over the entire land of Israel, he said, is the irrevocable right of the Jewish people. It's our obligation and not a matter of choice to fulfill it. It's important to look at Levin's leadership in the push for annexation for two reasons. The first is because he's now in position to lay the legal groundwork for its implementation. The second is because the government's annexationist plans, both within Israel and internationally, tend to be dismissed as the vision of the extremist settler politicians and parties it's empowered, and upon whose backs Netanyahu was able to climb back to power after 4 inconclusive elections and a short-lived stint in the opposition. The Land of Israel Caucus, which Levin co-founded in order to advance cross-party legislative strategies and alliances aimed at annexation, has always been dominated by the Likud. In the 23rd Knesset, when the caucus was established, Likud parliamentarians made up 44% of its members, comprising more than half of the party's elected representatives. Since then, it's the 24th Knesset that ended last November. 87% of Likud's Knesset members were a part of the caucus, representing 57% of the caucus. A few years before that, the Likud Central Committee voted to endorse annexation as part of its platform.
These are facts, they're numbers. You can quantify this.
Despite their explicit agenda in the broader public discourse, Netanyahu and the Likud are perceived to be overhauling the Israeli system of government for different megalomaniac and corrupt reasons. The prime minister, the argument goes, is currently on trial for corruption, a major reason his historical partners have cited for abandoning him, and the only way for him to guarantee his stays out of jail is by seizing control of the judicial branch. Within that narrative, the government overhaul is being framed merely as a power grab, albeit one with far-reaching consequences for Israel's economy, diplomatic standing, civil rights, and one of the most fraught fault lines of all religion and state. It's the smaller, more radical parties in this latest Netanyahu government led by Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich that are popularly credited with using the judicial overhaul as a way to finally achieve their dream of annexation, unfettered settlement and expansion, and the expulsion of as many Palestinians as possible. To most of the opposition, they're at best opportunists who identified a moment where their messianic fantasies converge with Netanyahu's personal interests and where they finally have leverage because without them the government would collapse. As a result, the struggle to save Israeli democracy points its dystopia as a parallel to the descent into an authoritarianism seen in Hungary and Poland over the past decade. Stopping the urbanization of Israel has thus become a rallying cry of sort for the opposition. A settler ethos that crosses all aisles. The reason for the dissonance between the opposition's narrative and the Likud's real agenda is twofold. First, because it's partly true, Netanyahu does indeed need those coalition partners, namely for his own political survival and personal freedom. The second reason boils down to the fact that the Israeli opposition and Netanyahu share the same ideology, Zionism, the bedrock of which the belief that Allah gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people, that Jews have a right to settle any and all parts of the land, and that the survival of the Jewish people is dependent on the physical and political manifestation of that teaching. The only serious challenge to that vision, the failed Oslo process, envisioning partition and various degrees of limited Palestinian autonomy, never challenged the fundamental Zionist belief that the entire land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people, where Israeli leaders like Yitzhak Rabin and Ariel Sharon diverged. Where they diverged was about strategic compromise, not ideology. They, and those Israelis who followed their respective paths, never saw giving up on the full implementation of what has been known, or what has become known, as maximalist or expansionist Zionism, as negating it in any way. That cornerstone of Zionism is why Rabin, Sharon, Barak, Shimon Peres, Ehud Olmert, Zippy Livni, and every major Israel politician whose proposers sought to make territorial concessions never dreamed of giving up all of Israel's settlements beyond the Green Line. A decade removed from the last credible peace process, support even for limited territorial concession has almost evaporated in Israel. Irrespective of its historical accuracy, the Israeli left's idea of land for peace has been discredited as proven failure by most Zionist Israelis. Even those remaining political parties still supporting a two-state solution, even just in theory long ago, internalized the futility of pursuing it. A recent poll found that Jewish Israeli support for a permanent apartheid regime in which Israel controls all the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean but doesn't grant equal rights to Palestinians has doubled from 15 to 29% just in the past 2 years. The number of Jewish Israelis who support two states dropped from 43 to 34% over the same period of time. Even more damning, a significant cross-section of those protesting against the Netanyahu-Levin Smotrich Ben Gvir plan and also warning of blood in the streets share the underlying set of ideological principles and policy goals their plans designed to achieve. For some Israelis, their opposition is personal. They abhor the idea of someone on trial for corruption leading their country. For others, like Avigdor Lieberman and many secular Israelis worried about religious coercion, it's about Netanyahu's alliance with religious Jewish parties. For those more affiliated with the center-left, the differences are about the cost to Jewish experience of Israeli democracy and quasi-liberalism. Many economists and business elites are simply terrified of the predicted damage to Israel's economy from an erosion of the rule of law and an independent judiciary. The problem with Israeli democracy, because these differences are not ideological, almost nobody's reckoning with the dissonance between their understanding of the Israeli democracy they are fighting to save and the intrinsically undemocratic and illiberal apartheid regime upon which their sovereignty has already been predicated. The Israeli center and much of the Israeli right opposes the near-term annexation of the West Bank because they believe the status quo of a temporary 55-plus-year military occupation is more strategically prudent under the current circumstances. Formally erasing the distinction between the occupied territories and the recognized territory of Israeli proper, in their view, would make it too difficult to convince the world that Israel is not an apartheid regime in which half of the population Palestinians are denied basic democratic, civil, and human rights. That dissonance comes into focus when considering that the opposition to Netanyahu's plan is not offering a competing vision. They are not suggesting Israel adopt a constitution with formal guarantees of equality, civil rights, democracy, or clarity on matters of religion and state. They are not willing to denounce the expansionist aspirations of Levin, Smotrich, and Ben Gvir because those aspirations and the belief that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people are baked into the Zionist ethos. They are not capable of defining what Israel democracy actually looks like if it continues ruling undemocratically over millions of Palestinians without granting them their equal rights. The chasm some are warning could lead Israel into a civil war. Therefore, is not about competing visions for the country. It's that one group is no longer content waiting for the right conditions to fulfill the Zionist dream of Jewish sovereignty over the entire land of Israel, while the others prefer sticking to the political tradition of buying time by deciding not to decide. For Netanyahu, Levin, Smotrich, and Ben Gvir, the consequences of formalizing an apartheid regime that undercuts the notion of Israeli democracy and some of the privileges and fortune that label affords them are worth the cost. If the world is ever willing to impose one, and for the opposition putting forth a genuinely alternative vision would require a level of self-interrogation and challenging of core beliefs that almost nobody would undertake voluntarily. And from the cradle.co, Israeli rescue team accused of smuggling historic text from Turkiye. The Zaka rescue team has been accused of smuggling the Book of Esther, a sacred biblical text, to Israel. An Israeli rescue team which arrived in Turkey to assist in rescuing survivors following a devastating earthquake allegedly smuggled a sacred biblical text back to Israel after it was uncovered among the rubble, Turkish media reported on 19 February. The Israeli emergency response team Zaka took the biblical manuscript, the Book of Esther, from Turkey's earthquake-damaged Antakya synagogue in Hatay province before the theft was discovered, and the manuscript returned to Turkey, Haber 7 reported. The Jerusalem Post also confirmed the theft of the historical book, claiming that the sacred manuscript was handed over to the rescuers. A local Turkish citizen gave the text to Major Haim Atmatsgen, a member of the Israeli rescue team, to protect it from looters. However, the news caused outrage among the Turkish population and authorities as the team did not receive permission to take the text to Israel. The anti-smuggling department launched an investigation into the case, which will be handled in collaboration with the Turkish Foreign Ministry. Following the investigation, the appropriate decisions will be made, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism announced in an official statement. On 19 February, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism tweeted, "The Chief Rabbinate of Turkey is preserving the historic Esther scroll discovered in our Antakya synagogue, which was destroyed in earthquakes. Artifacts belonging to all types of beliefs and cultures that have lived within the borders of our nation for centuries will continue to be carefully preserved in these lands," the statement continued. The death toll from the devastating earthquake that hit Turkiye and Syria has risen to 44,000, according to the Turkish Ministry of Interior, while the UN has appealed for $1 billion to address the growing humanitarian crisis. On 20 February, southern Turkey was struck by another 6.4 magnitude earthquake, according to Turkey's Disaster and Emergency Agency, AFAD. And from the Palestine Chronicle, historical manuscript returned to Turkey after being taken by Israel's rescue team. Israel returned a historical manuscript that was reportedly taken to Israel by the search and rescue team, dispatched to Turkey following the deadly earthquake that hit the country on February 6, Turkish media reported. The Turkish Haber 7 News website that the Israeli search and rescue team took the Book of Esther from the earthquake-damaged synagogue of Antakya in the Hatay province. The manuscript was later returned to Turkey following mediation by the local Jewish community. The Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism confirmed on Sunday that the anti-smuggling department has begun an investigation into this case. All allegations are being meticulously investigated by the anti-smuggling department of our ministry, and the process is handled in coordination with our Ministry of Affairs, the ministry said. The ministry also said in a series of tweets that it's committed to preserving the heritage manuscripts of all cultures and religions. The Israeli newspaper Yedioth Ahronot published a news item last week confirming that the Israeli search and rescue team had moved the historical Book of Esther, recovered from the Antakya synagogue, to Israel, alleging that they did it in an attempt to preserve the scrolls. The Israeli newspaper published pictures of a man who was reportedly a member of the Israeli team holding the scrolls.